Okay, 1863, Part 2. Now, we left off after Gettysburg, changes that we see here. Of course, one of the questions that historians often ask is, what really could the Confederacy have done if they had succeeded in Gettysburg? Was it really an invasion? Was it just a skirmish? Obviously, the Confederacy did not have the logistical capacity to sustain a deep penetration into enemy territory or an extended stay with even limited penetration. Lee recognized this, became more desperate, and this is why many historians view Pickett's charge as the option taken. Now, of course, there was a lot of criticism of Lee among the ranks at Gettysburg. Many believed that it was a foolhardy attempt. Longstreet, of course, for one, absolutely did not want to do it. Lee, in the end, of course, recognized that it was his mistake. But again, did he feel that he had to take some kind of desperate move? So, Gettysburg, July 1st through the 3rd, gets to another burg over on the other part of the country, or in the west, if you will, in Vicksburg. Now, the siege of Vicksburg had begun in October of 1862. It was certainly ramped up in June of 1863, and again, spoiler alert, it would end on July 4th, 1863. Vicksburg and Port Hudson were the last of Confederate strongholds on the Mississippi River. This little slice of Mississippi River was essential to the Confederacy. It allowed supplies, troops, war materials, and arms to come in from the west. Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas were considered the breadbasket of the Confederacy. The foodstuffs from this region helped to feed everyone in the Confederacy. Additionally, the Mexico-Texas border was used to bring supplies in from the south, but this too required use of the Mississippi. Lincoln and Jefferson Davis considered this the key to the war. The Union outnumbered the Confederacy 2-1 at Vicksburg, and this was Grant versus Pemberton. Grant had made many attempts to take Vicksburg. As I had mentioned, he attacked the city from the south and the east. Pemberton's garrison and the siege itself actually would last from May 25th through July 4th. I mentioned it starts in October. That's when the attacks. That's when Grant initially begins to take Vicksburg, and he learns from his mistakes along the way. But by July, Pemberton's garrison was reduced by disease and starvation, while the city's residents were forced to seek refuge in caves in surrounding hillsides. There are some amazing photographs of this available, if you get a chance to look those up. Hunger ruled the day for troops and civilians. Troops resorted to eating mule. Pemberton mentioned that they found it, quote, not only nutritious, but very palatable. So if anybody wants to go out and try some mule later, good luck with that. Leading to eventual surrender because of this hunger. Grant offered no terms per his reputation, but he did eventually parole prisoners to avoid having to feed that army. Parole being you basically promise to not fight in the war again, and then you're let go. Of course, most of these people would come back to fight, and many of these paroled troops would actually fight again in Chattanooga. Now, parole, again, this is kind of a logistical option for leaders because you might have enough trouble supplying and feeding your own men, and you take these prisoners of war. You can't transport them. You can't transport them easily. You have to feed them. So in many ways, it's easier to just say, hey, promise not to fight, we'll let you go. Of course, even though many on both sides realized that parole really didn't mean much. And again, what we see here generally is unconditional surrender, and that's one of Grant's nicknames is unconditional surrender Grant. Lee would not allow for weakening of his forces, thus he did not assist at Vicksburg. This is kind of significant because, of course, what's going on during this time, the preparation to go into Gettysburg, or go up to the north, and then the fighting at Gettysburg. So Lee possibly could have reinforced at Vicksburg. Maybe it makes a difference, maybe it doesn't, but this would lead, of course, to losing both. The strategic location, again, along the Mississippi River, this cut off the avenue of supplies to the Confederacy. It occurred simultaneous to Gettysburg, thus victory in the west and the east. Now, notably, this would cut the Confederacy in half, and of course, the Union now controls the Mississippi River. Most of it, we're going to get to the last little bit of that here soon. This also showed the brilliance of Grant, who had tried to take Vicksburg for quite a while. Finally, he would change course. He would move away from the town to take it, by doing so leading Pemberton's troops outside the city itself. When Davis told him to stay in the city regardless, Joe Johnston helped to convince Pemberton to make the move anyway. The impact, of course, Grant would take these 37,000 prisoners from battles of Port Gibson and Vicksburg. Again, he paroles them. But Confederates had 10,000 killed and wounded with some deserters. This led to the siege of Jackson by Sherman. This facilitated this. The Confederacy, again, cut in two. Communication cut off with Confederate forces in the Trans-Mississippi Theater for the remainder of the war. This is not insignificant. The city would not celebrate Independence Day for 80 years due to the siege and the date of the surrender. The full campaign claimed over 10,000 Union casualties and over 9,000 Confederate casualties. And notably, also supply-wise, the Confederacy had to turn over 172 cannons and over 50,000 rifles. After Vicksburg, Grant is put in command of all troops in the West. He will go to Chattanooga with Sherman to relieve starving soldiers there in November. So, Gettysburg, Vicksburg, how can you talk about those two without Port Hudson? On July 9th, 5 days after Vicksburg falls, the last Confederate garrison on the Mississippi, the Port Hudson, would fall to the Union as Confederate troops there would finally surrender. Lincoln would say, quote, "The Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea." Well, Lincoln was a man of many quotes. This is an interesting one. Basically, what he meant is this ended the use of the Mississippi as a supply route or any form of transportation for the Confederacy and only tightened the noose initiated in the West to further the Anaconda Plan. Now, back up a little bit here. We talked earlier this term about Scott's Anaconda Plan. This was a diplomatic effort, not really diplomatic, but it was a way to avoid war, to stave off war. It was considered folly by men under Scott. And this would lead them to eschew it as a plan. Hey, let's go to war. Let's make this happen now. That Anaconda Plan is going to take too long, yada, yada, yada. And of course, what is it that ultimately wins the war? Essentially the Anaconda Plan, only in the context of war rather than in peace. So, Scott was an older guy. He had fought in previous wars, and many made fun of him because they felt he was a little long in the tooth. But this is just another example of sometimes the people who have age and experience on their side, maybe you need to listen to them too. Of course, there is some disappointment in Union efforts here. Going back to the first video lecture, Lee retreated from Gettysburg, essentially with his tail between his legs. The Confederate Army was decimated by that loss. Meade, like McClellan before him, failed to chase. Lincoln, as we noted, hoped that Meade would pursue, capture Lee, and end the darn war. When Lee learned of Lee's escape, he said in disbelief, quote, "Our army held the war in the hollow of their hand, and they would not close it." He's not happy with Meade either. Now, Meade, again, look, they fought hard for 3 days in extreme heat. They're exhausted. They needed to rest. Maybe they did. Maybe you push forward at that time and try to finalize the war. So, again, significant victories here. Gettysburg, Vicksburg, and Port Hudson, all really within a week of each other. But before we get to Chickamauga and Chattanooga, which really kind of finalizes the Union's plan here in 1863, I want to talk about Lawrence, Kansas again. Quantrill's raid. August 21st, 1863. Now, Bleeding Kansas, we've discussed quite a bit, 1854 through 1861, numerous attacks and reprisals across the border from both sides. William Quantrill organized a band of raiders in December of 1861 to fight for the Confederacy as a guerrilla outfit. They raided and attacked Kansas towns over the first few years of the war. This was not done solely for the war, though. This was also done for personal gain. In these raids, they would loot homes and businesses, sometimes burning them to the ground, taking any money or goods they could find. Now, the August 21st raid, this was, again, a raid of Lawrence with a band of between 300 and 400 men. They would destroy over 200 homes and businesses, leaving 150 dead or dying. The estimates actually range as high as 200. The raiders would lose one person. One description of the raid told the story of a judge who was chased around his home until he was shot while holding his wife in his arms. The raiders then burned the house to the ground, forbade the wife from extracting the husband, and forced her to watch him devoured by flames. Now, what caused them to do all this? Revenge. We often paint the Confederates as the only bad guys, but there were bad actions on both sides. Obviously, the Confederate reason d'etre, whatever you want to put it, the reason for their state in and of itself was quite faulty. But in this case, Quantrill's raid again comes about because of revenge. The split between Kansas and Missouri only grew during the war. Missouri would stay in the Union but was torn apart by each side. 100,000 would serve in the Union Army, 40,000 Missourians would serve in the Confederacy. James Henry Lane led the charge for Kansas, and he was brutal. He too benefited personally from these raids, and he took no quarter. After the war started, he sought to punish Missourians as he and his Jayhawkers, that's where you get the name Jayhawks, he and his Jayhawkers would raid and burn to the ground numerous western Missouri towns: Harrisonville, Platte City, Osceola, Pleasant Hill, Butler, and Papenville. We briefly discussed John Fremont in his General Order Number 1 in August of 1861. This established martial law throughout the state. Quote, all property, real or personal, of those in opposition to the U.S. government will be confiscated and slaves freed. Those affected will be subject to court-martial and death. Now, Lincoln would remove the freeing of the slaves from this and replace Fremont with Henry Halleck, as we've discussed, but he was even worse. He would suspend habeas corpus in Missouri and issue General Order Number 32. This stated that anyone caught sabotaging railroad would be summarily shot. And those who have information about such attempts and do not communicate this information will be treated the same, as if they were participants. So, I guess, so much for rule of law, right? So much for due process. You are shot if you mess with the railroad. If you know that somebody's going to mess with the railroad and you don't tell on them, you're shot. His General Order Number 2 recognized that there were guerrilla forces in the state and that anyone caught in such activity became an outlaw. Quote, all persons are hereby warned that if they join any guerrilla band, they will not, if captured, be treated as ordinary prisoners of war, but will be hanged as robbers and murderers. Their lives shall atone for the barbarity of their general. And Missouri was loyal to the Union. To be sure, many of those from Kansas showed no judgment, no discretion. They would simply attack those in in Missouri regardless of affiliation, and they did not stop to ask if anyone was loyal or rebel. Henry Younger, for example, was a Unionist and a U.S. government employee, but he was shot to death after he reported a raid by Kansas on his livery stable. Mrs. Younger was constantly abused by forces who forced her to set her own home on fire. She and her 4 youngest children would be forced to trudge through the snow to the next town, which was 8 miles away. Again, these are Union supporters attacking other Union supporters. Makes no sense. Another example, Unionists had been pressured to stop assaults on Kansas, which led to officials arresting female relatives of some of the most notorious guerrillas. They were suspected of spying and passing along information to the guerrillas, and were held while imprisoned in a row house in Kansas City awaiting transport to St. Louis for trial. The prison collapsed, killing 5 of them and crippling others. Included in the dead was 15-year-old Josephine Anderson, sister of Bloody Bill Anderson. Missourians were out enraged. Many were torn. They wanted to remain in the Union, but were being attacked by that very Union indiscriminately, and some would end up changing sides. Thus, why we have Quantrill's raid. The raid focused solely on white males old enough to carry guns. Women, blacks, and children were not harmed in the raid, and this is significant. So now we'll move away from some of the terror aspects of the war and get to Chickamauga, which occurred September 19th and 20th. This would be the second costliest land battle of the war with over 34,000 casualties. After success at Tullahoma, Rosecrans went to Chattanooga to push the rebels back to Georgia. But Braxton Bragg sought to retake Chattanooga, and he followed Rosecrans, leading to numerous skirmishes between the two. After the fighting begins, reserves from the Army of North Virginia under Longstreet came to help. They would exploit a gap in the Federal line and drive Rosecrans and 1/3 of his army from the field. Preventing absolute disaster was General George Thomas, one of the true heroes for the Union. He and his men would hold Horseshoe Ridge, allowing the Federals to withdraw at nightfall. This led to his nickname, the Rock of Chickamauga. In the words of one veteran, Thomas, quote, saved the army from defeat and rout. Again, love the nicknames in the Civil War. The Rock of Chickamauga certainly sticks out. Union troops would end up retreating to Chattanooga. The rebels would follow. But first, one significant development, Grant is made commander of all operations in the Western Theater in October, and this was important. We get to Chattanooga 4 days after the Gettysburg Address. On November 19th, the battle would begin. Rebel forces had laid siege on Chattanooga. They took hold of Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge, which gave them a complete view of the city. They had stopped supplies from entering, and the Army of the Cumberland, which was holding the city, was literally starving. Grant looked to lift the siege and deftly opened the Cracker Line across the Tennessee River to get supplies into Chattanooga. He would also bring Tecumseh's Army of the Tennessee into the city. Also important here, the first thing Grant did upon arrival in Chattanooga was replace Rosecrans with the Rock of Chickamauga. Thomas would respond, quote, "We will hold the town until we starve." On the 23rd, the Federals would fight their way out of Chattanooga, first gaining a foothold on Missionary Ridge. Grant would then launch an attack on Lookout Mountain, capturing it after 6 hours of battle. George Thomas would eventually break the center of the Confederate line along Missionary Ridge, which would lead to a Confederate withdrawal. Now, why is Chattanooga important? Why is Nashville important? We talked about Nashville previously. What about Chickamauga? Why is this campaign worthy of note? Why do I personally put it alongside Gettysburg and Vicksburg as one of the three keys to the last part of 1863? Specifically because it opens up the South for invasion from the West. By taking Chattanooga, by securing Tennessee, Sherman now can sweep on down and go east to the Atlantic. And we will get to this when we discuss 1864. His march to the sea. It is because of this victory that Sherman now has pretty much a free path to go. There's one more thing I want to mention in 1863. In December of that year, Lincoln would come out with his prospective Reconstruction plan. This is significant. He would offer amnesty to all but a few high government officials, recognition of democratically elected governments, as long as 10% of those who voted in 1860 swore loyalty to the Union and accepted emancipation. Now, in a few weeks, we'll get to the discussion of Reconstruction, the different views that were taken. Presidential Reconstruction, which was somewhat conservative, and then Johnson, of course, takes over after Lincoln is assassinated. Radical Reconstruction, which is much more aggressive. Many were highly critical of Lincoln's Reconstruction plan. This is one of the reasons why, when we get to the 1864 election, there were many who didn't even want Lincoln on the Republican ticket. And this is why, because again, many believed that vengeance should be sought against the Confederacy. And here's Lincoln proposing a plan. When the war's over, look, you got a plan. What's going to happen? And he says at least as long as 10% of those who voted in the 1860 election swore loyalty to the Union and accepted emancipation, he would recognize democratically elected governments in the South and give amnesty to all but a few high government officials. Very lenient plan. Many did not agree with this, but again, this kind of lays the groundwork for some of the division that we'll see. So that's 1863. Again, Emancipation Proclamation and the draft riots. And then you get to the second half, Gettysburg, Vicksburg, Chattanooga.